Welcome, everybody, to another Crincast, which is my affectionate nickname for this wonderful opportunity to do a podcasting interview with a series of our industry's leaders on behalf of the Clean Resource Innovation Network and the delegation that is going to Baku in Azerbaijan for COP29. It's my pleasure today to have with me Justin Riemer, who is the CEO of Emissions Reduction Alberta, a phenomenal organization that runs some pretty impressive legislation here in Alberta that's critically important in context of some of the important conversations that will go on at Baku, and particularly vis-a-vis climate finance. Justin is no stranger to COPs. He's been to COP27 in Egypt, COP28 in Dubai. He'll be journeying to Baku shortly in Azerbaijan. And if he plays his cards right, I'm sure he's going to show up at COP30 in Brazil, which is an important one relative to the job he does because it's a national stock-taking COP in terms of the emissions dynamic. And so welcome, Justin.
Thank you very much, Bill. Honored to be here.
Yeah, and so you're hot off a very exciting day where your organization and the International Energy Agency's GHG research arm we're really hosting a critically important global conversation in the climate context about carbon capture and utilization and storage and some of the phenomenal dimensions that Canada has to offer and also learn from the world. So as we kick things off, reflect on that as part of a climate discourse that's already existing and what Canadians are doing in that space.
Well, it has been a phenomenal day. So over the past year, we've worked with the IEA's GHG group to put on a global conference called the Greenhouse Gas Technologies Conference in Calgary. Here it goes for the next 4 days. And over 1,500 people registered from that from 40 different countries. And it is known as the global leading carbon capture and sequestration conference. And what better place to have that conference than in Calgary, where we are leading the world in many carbon capture and sequestration technologies, projects, and actual deployment. Not a lot of people realize that we have had GHG reduction technologies deployed and CCS deployed for over a decade here through the Shell Quest project already at an industrial scale. And there's a variety of others that are under construction currently and being planned. Alberta has the best geology, regulatory policy framework, expertise, and knowledge and know-how, and then the point source emissions to do this dramatically on a global scale and to bring the world here to showcase that not only through the conference sessions, but we'll be taking them up to a lot of the sites and showing them firsthand is a great privilege for us.
So I want to make a point here to reinforce the great points that you just made is the Alberta government has sort of been thinking long range about this, right? Yes. It's not something we woke up to and said, hey, we can stick these dense phase CO2 subsurface in this great geology.
That's right.
I mean, it was in 2010 that the provincial government amended the Mines and Minerals Act to, in effect, expropriate pore space on behalf of you and I, right? The public that owns the pore space. And so that's a critical part of a conversation that I'm sure these global delegates are starting to sort of say, wow, they do things differently in Alberta and in Canada relative to that integration of regulation and good sound public policy.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of forward-thinking policy right from the Stelmach era where we were the first jurisdiction in North America to put a price on carbon. As you mentioned, the changes to the regulation for the pore space allocation. And a variety of other measures, including some made under Premier Daniel Smith in terms of the ACIP or the tax incentive for CCS projects that help with the economic viability of these projects longer term and are helping getting a lot of projects to final investment decision making.
So when you put all of this into a sort of global climate context and the things that Emissions Reduction Alberta, and I'm going to get you to go into detail on those in just a moment, part of the discourse globally is around the role that fossil fuels and the petroleum sectors play in emissions production. But part of what we're seeing at GHGT 17, the work that ERA does, you're integrating together a community of emitters all with the same goals, right?
Yes.
We're talking about fertilizer production, cement production. It's just not the oil and gas sector that bears the burden of this.
Very much so. And it's that conglomeration of different sectors that are high emitters and paying into a carbon levy right now that funds our organization, Emissions Reduction Alberta. And the quid pro quo that government set up is we're going to charge you for your emission intensity, but we're going to reinvest a portion of those funds back into technology that's not only going to help reduce emissions, but create economic opportunity. And that's really our dual mandate. And that's really important for us to understand is you can improve environmental outcomes as well as improving economic outcomes. And so that's a lot of what our focus is on a ERA.
So when you were in Egypt and in Dubai, and when you're in Baku, and you talk about how the ERA mechanism works, again, I say it, my own shorthand is the polluter pays for progress principle, right? The polluters are paying for the innovation ecosystem that is actually going to enable their own aspirations on emissions reduction.
Yes.
Hey, is that why they call it Emissions Reduction Alberta?
That's why.
And I think it's an important thing. And as much as I cheese about it, it used to be called the Climate Change and Emissions Management Corporation.
That's right.
So sort of reflect on how you've been telling that story globally, because it's not something that in Alberta we woke up and said, hey, we need to do this last year.
Yeah,
It's been part of the game plan for a long time.
It has. So we've been in existence now for 15 years, which is quite a track record for an organization like ours. And I would say there's very few organizational entities around the world that are set up quite the same way we are and funded quite the same way we are with the results that we've seen. Others are very curious. I get approached very often when we're at global conferences, how do I set up an ERA in my jurisdiction?
Right, exactly.
So there's a lot of interest in the model. So as stated, we get our funding from the government of Alberta, from the TIER fund, from the carbon levy that the industrial emitters pay, and we take a portion of that TIER fund and we reinvest it through competitive funding calls on late-stage technology demonstration. So what's called technology readiness levels, typically 7 to 9, the later stage industrial demonstrations of technologies across the waterfront. We're technology agnostic. The technology has to both reduce emissions as well as create economic opportunity, and it has to be deployed in Alberta. And with those caveats, we've done everything from geothermal to feasibility studies on small nuclear reactors to smart electrification, transmission technologies, digital technologies, critical minerals, as well as carbon capture, sequestration, and hydrogen production and utilization.
And so the price of admission to that great funding opportunity is also the opportunity for the government through ERA to validate the true emissions reduction potential through third-party independent verification.
Yes.
And so you were able this year to release a very cool database.
Yes.
Because that is really important in terms of transparency. So that database allows anybody in the world to go look at that and see by sector, by blending sectors with some of the cool tools you have, but more importantly, to see some of the great stories of the women and men who are building this stuff and whose ingenuity is driving the innovation bus forward.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a highly valuable extraction that we get from our investment. So the caveat when we provide our grant funding to these technologies is we're going to provide you this funding, but in return, we want to see some of the data returned on what you're learning, what the emissions are doing as a result of the deployment of your technology. And we're going to showcase those findings to the world to enhance the transparency so that the globe can learn how effective these technologies are at reducing emissions. So as you mentioned, we do have third-party verifiable independent evaluation of our emissions reduction on our various projects. And we're learning a great deal through that. And as you so kindly mentioned, we recently put that up on our website, eralberta.ca, under the projects tab. And you can search by any sort of technology project or sector and look at what the projects we funded have achieved or not achieved in terms of emissions reduction.
Yeah, because that nuance is there's learning in the failures.
Absolutely.
Right? And there's no, failures is not an appropriate word, but it makes the point is that somebody may have had an aspiration.
That's right.
And it didn't work out as planned.
Yes.
But the next person down the line benefits from the learning of the person up the line. Yeah. So that database should be a global treasure trove of insights for any jurisdiction, to your point, that wants to set something up like this, right?
Very much so. And that's what we're hoping to achieve. And that's where there's a lot of interest from global players in this space, is learning from the demonstrations and technology development that we've already undertaken. So they don't have to repeat the same mistakes and they can learn from the successes of some of the projects we funded.
So the other dimension, when I think about the journeys you've made to the COPs, and as we've talked about already, COP30 in Brazil will be the updating of the national defined contributions that all the countries make, and updating, what they say they're going to achieve by certain timeframes and this sort of thing. When you think about the role that emissions reduction plays in producing the quantifiable, verifiable, empirical data around really what's happening in the space.
Yes.
I mean, the TIER program itself is a massive data repository of fascinating insights, right?
Yes.
And so explain to our viewers and listeners that every facility in there is set a mandate for reductions. Because where I'm leading you to is sort of a discussion around, we've got a pretty good carbon market structure here from a comprehensive, reliable market with integrity that we can also share with the world.
Absolutely. So we started off with emission intensity targets with all of our industrial emitters. And it's important to know it's not oil and gas, as you mentioned. It's cement, it's fertilizer, it's power generation. And they're all under these emission intensity targets that if they do not meet those targets, they have to pay into a levy. And that carbon price has been going up and tracking the federal price over the past several years. It started up at $15 a ton. We're now, up to $85, I believe, dollars a ton. So it is significant. And what that has enabled companies to do is evaluate and stock take the current market situation because they have the ability to buy credits and offset credits, or they have the ability to fund cash and provide cash and funds into the tier revenue, which we then take that portion of that funds and we reinvest in other technologies. And so we've had a carbon market of sorts here in this province for over 15 years. And there's been a lot of learnings from that process. And we're still learning as we go. The globe is learning. There's a lot of challenges globally with the transparency and liquidity of carbon markets right now. And I'm not sure where that's taking us. We tend to step outside of that when we're dealing typically with just the revenue of dollars paid into the tier funds and then reinvesting that into technologies that have a demonstrable benefit for the sectors and markets. But what we're seeing in many, many instances right now is that projects are increasingly technologically feasible, but in many cases, they're not economically feasible. And so the whole discussion around clean technology and adoption and deployment is centering much more so around economics than it is just purely around technology viability. And that's one of the things we're trying to help inform. We work with our government partners to inform them what we're learning on this. I'll give you a great example. So we did 11 pre-feasibility studies on carbon capture projects in all of those sectors I mentioned: cement, power generation, oil and gas, fertilizer. There was a lot of learnings the companies accrued in those feasibility studies. Again, Capital Power is a great example. They were at one point moving towards a final investment decision for the first carbon capture sequestration of a power generator, natural gas power, combined cycle plant in North America, I believe. But given some of the uncertainty around carbon price, given some of the uncertainty around the clean electricity regs and what have you, it is a very, very expensive project. And the feasibility study we provided funding for helped articulate and put more specific numbers in the evaluation criteria that made them come to this conclusion, and I think a correct conclusion at this time, that it's not economic. It might be economic if circumstances change, if there's more policy certainty, if there's more changes in the marketplace longer term. It's not a matter of technical viability, it's a matter of economic viability.
Well, certainly I know when you're in Baku and this conversation around finance, right?
Yes.
And see, really what you're describing is pure play market economics.
Yes.
When you factor in climate economics, the rationale for making a decision may change rapidly. And I think Alberta, all of those learnings that you've talked about so nicely really help shape a hybrid view of the world where climate economics meet and the role of government and government tax dollars in incenting some of these big projects that are going to make a significant difference.
Yes.
But I think also in terms of the tier program, I think from a leadership perspective, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I get my facts wrong, it was interesting to see that even companies with facilities that weren't falling under the large emitter legislation actually voluntarily opted to join into the tier program. Because, of course, those folks who are really investing in technology and innovation, they're quantifying their reductions that they're able to trade in the markets to the folks who may not meet their thresholds on a given year. Is that
right? And I'm not sure what the figures are in terms of that level of adoption, but I believe that to be the case. And what it has also spawned is a whole group of smaller firm innovators who are looking to solve the problems and challenges of the larger emitters through providing new technologies that will reduce emissions of the larger emitters. So yeah, it's really spawned all kinds of great activity. And in many ways, Alberta is leading the clean technology evolution within the country because of the markets and policies and regulatory standards we've adopted, in addition to the great skills, talents, and expertise we have. And of course, our funding doesn't hurt. as well as a variety of other ecosystem funding.
For sure. And I mean, those are all critically important stories that you're telling at COP. And one of the things I asked another leader that we were interviewing, who's also like you, a COP veteran, around how you keep your ears open on the ground to some of the cool things that our other jurisdictions are doing. You think, wow, I didn't realize that was happening, because COP is this enormous confluence of perspectives, right? And so between Egypt, Dubai, what have you heard and learned that might be of interest to our listeners and our viewers? And then what do you hope to pick up at Baku from what you see in terms of what the conversations are going to be like?
So I have to admit, the first COP I went to was in Egypt, and I found it completely overwhelming. Like you say, the world descended on this small place, and a multitude of conversations were happening all at once. And it was a challenge to navigate what rooms you needed to be in, which talks you needed to attend, which people you needed to be with to get your story heard and hear other things happening. You know, what I've picked up over the past couple of COPs I've gone to is there's a tremendous amount of technical evaluation, research and development going on emission reduction technologies like carbon capture sequestration, like hydrogen development, like renewables, and reducing the cost of renewable electrical generation. There is interesting evolutions in terms of the financing, because that's been one of the key challenges. We saw the spawn of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US over the past year and a half or so, and the tremendous amount of capital that's put on the table and spawned all kinds of investment announcements in different areas. One of the things that we evaluated, because we do a lot of comparisons with ourselves to the United States, and we've evaluated their investments at a grant level to technology through the Inflation Reduction Act over the past couple of years versus our ERA funding in Alberta. And when you look at it on a per capita basis, we're actually pretty similar. We tend to look at, the US has all this money, they're dumping way more money into this sector than Canada is. But when you look at it on the face and just on a per capita basis, we're hitting just at the same weight class as the US is, not so much on the tax credits, but on the grant funding for the later stage technology demonstration. And what's also interesting is the US is investing more right now on hydrogen and energy efficiency renewables. We're investing more on carbon capture and sequestration. And so just the relative comparisons of these technology deployments and how we stack up internationally, there's lots we can share and learn from one another. We're actually talking to the state of Wyoming, for instance, right now on lithium extraction. They're just as keen and have access to lithium extraction opportunities out of their oil and gas wells as we do. So I think there's lots of opportunities for cross-jurisdiction partnerships on technology development. And these things can come out of COP and some of the discussions that you have with many of the international players. The Middle East and the Saudis and UAE are investing significant amounts into clean technology generation. And we have actually a lot of expertise that we could be exporting to them, because many times they're starting from scratch, but they have a lot of funding to allocate to this and some creative financing means that we can learn from here as well.
That's a really critical series of really important linked points on it. It strikes me that I should ask you about another incredibly important Alberta organization, government agency that is equally important in the ecosystem, and that's Alberta Innovates in terms of the way funding works in the public interest, funding works in the sectoral and industrial across multiple jurisdictions. So just again, if you stumbled across somebody at Baku who said, I'm going to listen to what you have to tell me for half an hour, how would you tell the Alberta Innovates story as it connects to Emissions Reduction Alberta?
Thank you for mentioning that, Bill. So Alberta Innovates is a critical partner of ours. They're a larger organization than ours, and they have a number of project specialists and technical specialists that we utilize to evaluate our projects. And we recruit them in to help evaluate a lot of the projects. We don't have as much in-house expertise as they do. One of the things to help people understand where they play versus us is Alberta Innovates on the clean technology side focuses on the early technology readiness level. So the 2 to 6 level or 2 to 7 level, and then we take over at the 7 to 9 level. They'll help shepherd those early stage developments through their funding programs and through their expertise and knowledge. And then we will provide larger amounts of funding at those later stages where it's necessary. So we work very well in partnership with them.
So I participated in a CIBC Capital Markets Climate from Startup to Scale Up roundtable last week, and we were trying to sort of wrap our minds around how you take startups that are revving and move them more rapidly through the sort of innovation ecosystem to get them to commercial viability and scale up. I mean, I made the point to the audience, I said, we kind of do that here in Alberta already, right?
Yes.
If you look at from a life cycle perspective, we've got tools at the front end and tools at, it's the world's longest sales funnel in that sense.
Yes.
And when you travel the world and you have these conversations globally, you don't find too many other subnational jurisdictions that have that kind of system working on behalf of the innovators, whether you're just a guy with an idea here or you're somebody who's going to go out and change the world here.
Yes, we're very lucky in Alberta for the very robust innovation support ecosystem that we have, not only funding right through the early to later stages, but the mentorship and guidance we have through some of our clean tech accelerators. I think of Avatar Innovations, for instance,
Absolutely.
and Kevin Krausert's group, and a lot of the great work they're doing, the Clean Resources Innovation Network, and navigating different entrepreneurs through different bodies. I spend a good chunk of my time just helping SMEs navigate to the different entities they need to get to, depending on where they're at in their journey, so they have the best support possible to getting them through those commercialization hurdles. I should mention, I joined ERA 2 years ago, and I say I joined at peak decarbonization fervor. At that time, if you'll recall, everyone had a decarbonization project, no matter how expensive, and there was a huge amount of intensive interest in moving forward with hydrogen and CCS and renewables and what have you. Since that time, economics has seeped in and mattered more and more. And people are realizing that, yes, we need to decarbonize, but we need to do that in an economic way. And so there's been a slowdown in terms of some of the projects that had been aggressively pursued and announced. And it's not just happening in Alberta, it's happening globally. I read a report just recently that in the US, we talked about the IRA, 40% of the announcements that have been made aren't going ahead to final investment decision. 40%, that's high, right? And it could be even higher than that. So what's happening now is because of increased interest rates and other factors, venture capital is tightening up. It's harder for innovators to get access to financing. So even when we provide them our funding, they're having a challenge getting financing on the other end to bring their portion.
Absolutely.
It's getting harder to get access to industrial sites to demonstrate their technologies. There's only so many industrial sites in the province. And for good reason, these industrial players have a lot of risk aversion in terms of letting new players into their playing field while they're busy making something. So that's one of the challenges. We've had some policy and regulatory uncertainty in certain areas, and we need to hopefully get that rectified in the coming years. So it has been a challenge as of late seeing clean technology get through to the deployment and adoption scale. And we're trying to figure out, it's more than just funding that needs to get figured out to get these things through. And that's the kind of conversation we're having at the CCS conference this week is, what are the solutions needed to get deployment of CCS in many of these sectors?
You raise, again, a series of really important and interlinked points, but that sensitivity to what the market is saying, what the market's thinking, and what the market, more importantly, is doing.
Mm-hmm.
From governance perspective, ERA has a really neat structure in terms of its board of directors that allows you to sort of tap into real time with guys like Kevin Byrne from S&P Global.
Yes.
It allows you to tap into those and move the organization quite nimbly and agilely, I would think, right?
Very much so. So I think much of the hallmark of ERA's success has been our board of directors. I love our board of directors. They're an incredibly competent group of individuals from a variety of skills and expertise. You mentioned Kevin Byrne. We have a former president of Shell Canada, Clive Mathers, who's brilliant and gives us all kinds of international wisdom on things. We have a variety of other talent on that board that helps us think through strategically where we need to be in the market. And because of our governance structure, we can be a little more nimble than perhaps a government direct entity could be. We can bend on a dime quite quickly. We need to make sure our government partners are aligned to the directions we're going. But I'll give you a good example. So typically in the past, ERA funded hard technology and focused on not funding pre-feasibility studies. But we recognized there was a gap in the marketplace around industrial companies wanting to move forward with CCS projects and weren't able to get enough capital to move their pre-feasibility projects forward. So we held a competition specifically for feasibility studies for CCS. And through that, we had all kinds of applications and we came out with 11. But another good example, we used to fund purely hard tech. And that was because we wanted to see direct emission reductions from the technologies we funded. But through looking at it from an enabled GHG reduction lens, we are now able to fund digital technologies, critical minerals, and other things that contribute to emissions reductions. But you can't show a direct correlation to a piece of software and emission reduction, right?
Yeah.
But you're seeing such an advent in terms of artificial intelligence, machine learning, optimizing the flow of pipeline to reduce the energy it takes to move that product through a pipeline, for instance. And that's a big part of the portfolio that we need to start addressing and supporting into the future. So the changes we made in some of those areas have really enabled us to get larger portfolio performance.
So on that note, and just as we sort of navigate to the close of this conversation, and again, casting and rooting it into a Baku, a COP29 context, that nimbleness and that agility, which is not necessarily well known within government agencies and bureaucracies and the organizations, which sometimes can be sort of accused of intransigence and slow to act and not ERA. But one of that things, if you were telling somebody about the secrets of ERA's success over time, is that constant engagement. I know I was privileged last week to spend some time being queried about my thoughts as an Albertan around ERA, the work it does, where it goes in the future. And I guided them to the idea that ERA should set up regional advisory councils, in Grand Prairie and Red Deer and Medicine Hat, this sort of thing. But how would you tell that story, just as we close here, Justin, to people who may come from jurisdictions where transparency is not a value to be taken for granted?
Yes.
Right? And we own that poor space, you and I, and the others in this room. Yeah. And almost forgotten the value of transparency.
Yes, absolutely. So in one way, I think we take a very private sector lens to this in terms of transparency and getting market feedback to adapt to ensure that we have a product that the market values. We failed if we put out a technology competition and we get 2 applications. We need to ensure that we're listening to the marketplace and the innovators and the sectors constantly, because it's always changing on their current needs, their current challenges, and where we could step in and provide support. So in advance of every competitive call that we make, we have a large stakeholder engagement session that we have in different cities. We do virtually. We curate those lists to ensure we have a good representative sample from a variety of different smaller and larger innovators, people at different levels in the organizations, to make sure we're capturing the scope of a call and the needs for a particular call and how we evaluate a particular competition call dictated by what the market needs. And not just drinking our own bathwater in Alberta, but listening to what's going on in the rest of Canada and internationally is really important as well, because we tend to stay local on a lot of these conversations. That's been really important. But Bill, if I may, one other point I wanted to make, one of the big stories we're going to be telling in Baku that I think Albertans need to be more aware of is our methane story. We have done such a tremendous job here in the province and in Canada in our methane reductions from oil and gas, and most people aren't really aware of that. And part of that comes through the investments we've made in technologies that verify, measure, and then work to abate those emissions from oil and gas, particularly on the conventional side, methane reduction. And we've done such a phenomenal job here. We've spawned some great companies. I'm thinking of Kuva and Cube, who are on-site GHG measurement companies using artificial intelligence and machine learning. And they are exporting those technologies like crazy into the US now, because the US is actually far behind us in terms of their methane mitigation and abatement. And we are developing a product they need. And what's really interesting is that we need to be telling this story more globally, not just in terms of the track record of our emission reduction that we achieved not only through technology investment, but in terms of policy, regulatory, and working with the industry and understanding what the market needs and setting some tangible goals that the industry could abide by. But then telling that story to other jurisdictions like the US, like other parts of Asia or the Middle East, and also enables us to export technology and create an economic opportunity for our province, just like we've exported oil and gas technologies around the world for decades.
That is so well said, because if you can look at most energy jurisdictions around the world, there's always a bit of Canadian DNA, and regulatory DNA, public policy DNA. technology DNA in terms of Canadians doing good things.
Yeah.
So just in the final commentary, and I want you to think now about the year between Baku and Belém in Brazil. For organizations like CRIN and Alberta Innovates and Avatar and PTAC and all these wonderful parts of our ecosystem, what is it that you would say to your board of directors is we have a big lever here. I've learned this in Baku and I want to be able to announce it in Brazil.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm just creating a rhetorical framework here for you to think about. But what do you think that might be?
You know, what strikes me more and more as we have these COPs and these global sessions is that the proof really is in the pudding. That we've had lots of talk about goals and measures and policies and procedures. The actual execution of emission reduction projects at an industrial scale is pretty minimal relative to the aspirations of what we want to achieve. I believe what we're doing in Alberta, in part because of ERA, but in part because of a whole bunch of other attributes that we've talked about today, we are one of the global proof points on how you actually reduce emissions while keeping your economy competitive, while keeping your industries running, while not sacrificing your standard of living and creating employment for individuals. And so I think we need to get that proof point and demonstrate the outcomes of the Dows and the Air Products, hopefully the Heidelbergs and others that are doing CCS for real and not just talking about it and not just a couple slides on a PowerPoint. It's really happening. We're sequestering CO2 in the ground. We're mitigating emissions through this kind of hydrogen generation, so on and so forth. That's our compelling story that we need to get out, and we need to shout it from the rooftops, not only at COP, but at all kinds of global forums.
And everywhere in between.
Absolutely.
Couldn't think of a better way to wrap up our conversation. Thank you, Justin.
Thanks, Bill.